Okay. Does anyone have a question about queer theory? All right. So we're now going to take a second to think. Given all that we talked about, the context that you have, if queer theory is about freedom, what does race represent to E. Patrick Johnson? Right. So freedom in that it is universal, it is all about play, it is all about fluidity. What does race represent? So I'm going to give everyone 30 seconds to write down an answer. All right. How about Kelvin? What does race represent to E. Patrick Johnson then? Yeah, Kelvin, can you turn on your mic?
Hello.
Hello?
It kind of seems like a border since like there's a lot of discrimination between like queers and like in the queer community.
Okay, so it seems like a border. What do you mean a border?
Like
What's a border mean?
like there's always like gonna be like a difference, and like since there's discrimination, there's like
Say that one more time.
since there's like discrimination in like the queer community, uh like different like different races like usually like generally like will always like be around each other since like queers are like since like the community is like much like different.
Okay, so there will be, we do have to deal with the reality, right, and the materiality of race. And so you're right that race, unlike queerness, does not have the freedom to just be about play and to just be about difference. And so E. Patrick Johnson theorizes about race in terms of where it holds us. And in this way, he believes that he needs to get to a theory of the flesh, right? There's a history of material struggle, right, of material loss, and the the losses and the struggles of Black people in America are very particular. And so you have to ask the question then of where does that leave Black queer people? So on the one hand, right, we're supposed to understand ourselves through this queer community, but the queer community doesn't exactly invite us in. We're also supposed to subscribe to this idea of queerness, right, as a theory, but it's too universalizing. But we're also stuck, right, through race. We have to think through race. We have to think through our struggles. We have to think through class and the history of violence that we are born into. And so E. Patrick Johnson's articulation of queer theory is a way to think through these kind of simultaneous struggles. The questions that he then is asking, right, is about a particular articulation, right? And he thinks that the freedom, right, of queer theory, right, has to be maintained, but you have to pay particular attention to the struggle. He wants to capture, right, this universal in the spirit of playfulness, but he also thinks that the flesh is really the most important factor for grounding any theories in order for them to be useful for people. And that is how he comes up with queer theory. So this is an excerpt from his 2006 article about queer theory and everything I learned about being queer from my grandmother. He says, Quare, on the other hand, not only speaks across identities, it articulates identities as well, right? So it allows for new identities and new ways of thinking about identity. Quare offers a way to critique stable notions of identity, right? In the same way that we talked about race and about how it is very rigid and it needs to make room for queer people, right? So it can't be only rigid. And at the same time, you have to locate racialized and class knowledges, right? In this way, queer theory excludes that. So he wants to find a way to hold these two things together. His project is one of recapitulation and recuperation. I want to maintain the inclusivity and playful spirit of queer that animates much of queer theory, but I also want to jettison its homogenizing tendencies. As a disciplinary expansion, then, I wish to quare queer theory, such that ways of knowing are viewed both as discursively mediated, right, through discourse. Everything that we know happens through discourse and the ways in which we come together and think about them, and as historically situated and materially conditioned. This reconceptualization foregrounds the ways in which LGBT people of color come to sexual and racial knowledges. Moreover, queer studies acknowledges the different standpoints found among lesbians, bisexuals, gays, and transgender people of color in those differences that are also conditioned by class and gender. Queer studies is a theory of and for gays and lesbians of color. Thus, I acknowledge that in my attempt to advance queer studies, I run the risk of advancing another version of identity politics. Despite this, I find it necessary to traverse this political minefield in order to illuminate the ways in which some strands of queer theory fail to incorporate racialized sexuality. The theory that I advance is a theory in the flesh. Theories in the flesh emphasize the diversity within and among gays, bisexuals, lesbians, and transgender people of color, while simultaneously accounting for how racism and classism affect how we experience and theorize the world. Theories in the flesh also conjoin theory and practice through an embodied politics of resistance. This politics of resistance is manifest in vernacular traditions such as performance, folklore, literature, and verbal art. Does anyone have any questions about what queer theory is, given this definition?
I'm wondering, why do you think E. Patrick Johnson chooses to speak in a language of people of color as opposed to a language of blackness?
So you have to think about the shift in the academy. The academy was thinking through whiteness and white supremacy and people of color, right, until like 2009, 2010. And then even that shift in the vernacular of the academy did not fully take hold until maybe 2014-ish, 2013-ish, right, is when people started actually using that language in their writing. And so this is from an entirely different academic time than one that you know or understand through debate.
That makes sense.
Any other questions about queer theory? Well, so just to also put this out, he's also talking specifically, right, about Black people. So he does say, you know, people of color. He thinks queer theory can be inclusive enough to theorize about those other folks, but he's really specifically talking about Black queer people. But the people of color conversation is related to the whiteness conversation, and you know, those, we no longer talk about structural violence in terms of whiteness or white supremacy. We talk about it in terms of anti-Blackness and a particularity.
I guess I'm a little bit unclear of how like this notion of freedom or play is universalizing and how that's harmful. What I'm like kind of understanding is that like, so not all people have the same access to that universal, like to that freedom and play because of the lines of racism and classism. Is that like why the homogenizing view is bad? Or I don't exactly understand.
So queer theory is about complete fluidity, complete freedom, complete lack of any kind of grounding. So if you can't have if you have to have a complete flux in freedom, how can you ever attune yourself to a particular?
Okay, was I supposed to answer that question?
Yeah, so I'm asking you to think through what queer theory is when it was introduced. And so we now today have people who've tried to patch it up, right? And they try to attend to the particularity. But in the sense of pure queer theory, where queerness is just this massive fluctuation, where there is no stability, where there is no grounding, where you are just free and floating through space and time. How can you ever speak to a particular if you're not supposed to have a particularity?
Oh, okay. I see. So it's like, since you aren't tied, well, so traditional queer theory doesn't take into account the fact that people of color or Black people in particular are tied down because of race. So we should take into account like the more material constraints, I guess.
Yes.
Okay, cool.
Do we have any more questions?
I guess like, so is it that not being able to achieve this amount of flux results in like, I don't know, psychological violence as the impact? I'm just
Well,
not entirely
it's useless to Black people if your theory is about total freedom. Are Black people totally free?
no.
So how can we use queer theory to think about race?
Mhm. I see. So like so queer theory originally, as originally interpreted, just doesn't have any explanatory power when it comes to Black queer people.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that makes sense. Cool.
So one more question from anyone else? Okay. So we're gonna move on a little bit. This is a concept you should write down. It is really important to understand E. Patrick Johnson's work. And so when he means that we should think about performativity or a lot about context, in different contexts, subjectivity shifts. And he thinks of this through radical Black subjectivity. So the first thing you should write down is this and. And you should write that in comparison of and or. So in a similar vein of thought alongside intersectionality, he believes that we have multiple identities that are always at play. And the way in which Black queer people, Black queer, gendered and class people experience the world, really everyone who is Black, sometimes part of our identity comes to the forefront more than others. So if I am at a meeting at work and I'm in a room full of white people, I probably feel very, very Black, right? The way I speak, the things that I'm speaking about, the comments that they make, the way they talk about things, my Blackness really comes to the forefront. But if I go to a Black church, right, I feel very, very, very queer, right? I'm reminded about the way they talk and what they're talking about and how they talk about good and about religion. It generally will remind you of where that difference is. And so he wants to remind us that you're not one thing or another at a different time, right? Black queer people are and then he also adds in asterisk at the end of the last and, which shows that it can go on infinitely. And that there's not really a forced choice between one set of identities and another. They all pull together and come to the forefront or go to the background, depending on the context that you are in.
The new knowledge that I'm creating is multimodal methodologies. And what that means is I approach different cultural phenomenon through different ways of collecting data. So for instance, I do oral histories, and based on those oral histories, I present that research in different ways. I present it through books, through performance, and through documentary films. So I'm looking at the different ways to take the same source material and present them as scholarly material to different audiences. Some of the topics I focus on in my research are gender, sexuality, and race. So I've conducted oral histories from Black gay men, Black lesbian women, and a number of other communities that are seen as marginalized. I'm personally involved in this research because it comes from my own background. I was raised in the South. I am Black, I am gay, and there are not a lot of archives that feature that history. And so I wanted to create the archive that I wish I had had when I was coming up. Northwestern has contributed greatly to my research. When I came here 18 years ago, I fell in love with Northwestern because I didn't have to explain that creative work was scholarly. And so I've really grown and cut my teeth here as a scholar, as an artist, and as a teacher. One of the reasons why I love what I do is because I think that the research that I'm doing is having an impact not just on Northwestern and not just in Chicago, but the world. A lot of the people that I talk to through my oral histories don't have a platform to speak. And so what I try to do through my research is give them that platform.
Okay, so that was E. Patrick Johnson. And it just kind of, I forgot to say, this slide is going to explain why he thinks his work is important, but that's what it did. Does anyone have any questions about his work? All right, so we're going to start to get into these kind of performative things, histories, things like that. So now we have a basis to understand performativity and race and gender, and we're going to start talking a little bit more about performativity right now. Okay, so E. Patrick Johnson thinks that performance is important and we need to theorize about the way in which we perform. He says that theories of performance, as opposed to theories of performativity, also take into account the context and historical moment of performance, right? So it's not just this idea that we do things with our bodies, but it's that our bodies are grounded in particular historical moments. We need to account for the temporal and spatial specificity of performance, not only to frame its existence, but also to name the ways in which it signifies, right? So signifiers being, right, what information does this transmit to you or me? Foucault himself acknowledges that discourse has the potential to disrupt power. Discourses are not once and for all subservient to power or raised up against it, any more than silences are. We must make allowances for complex and unstable process. For that is definitely not supposed to be there. That D is not supposed to be there. An unstable process whereby discourse can be both an instrument and effective power, but also a hindrance, a stumbling block, a point of resistance. Discourse transmits and produces power. It reinforces it, but also undermines and exposes it. It renders it fragile and makes it possible to thwart it. And so I won't continue to read the rest of that. I can give people all these cards if they want later. They're really just excerpts from his chapter. The point is that power isn't all or nothing. It's not a zero-sum game. If we use power, if we use discourse, if we use strategies against systems of power, those systems of power can crumble and collapse. And so our performances, right, whether we are in the, on a stage or whether we're at a protest or whether we are, in a hospital or we are in church, those performances that we have in the particular moment, they have the ability to participate with systems of power, or they have the ability to undo or fight against systems of power. Here is the kind of big thing you got to understand why he thinks that these performances are powerful. And so disidentification is a mode of identification, and there's 3 sets of identification. The first identification is counter-identification. So counter-identification says we should see a system of power and we should just say the opposite is true. So Black conservatives in America, such as Candace Owens, right, counter-identify with the system of, racism in America. Or I guess, yeah, the system of racism in America. They say, that's not true. I don't identify with this notion of race. I don't identify with this notion of rigidity. That's just not me. I'm free. I can be free. And that's all that there is. And so they say we should counter that system and we should just say, well, it doesn't have power over me. You then have people who over-identify. You have people who say, well, the system has power. And so I might as well give myself to the system entirely. And that means that if capitalism is a system, I should just be the best Black capitalist that there is. And that is how I should get power. But E. Patrick Johnson says that this is silly because capitalism hurts Black people. And so if you participate in capitalism just blindly, it will, and you assume that it's neutral and you can just, use it, you're probably going to get hurt on the back end. And so this is where he says that we need disidentification and why it is particularly good for queers of color. So the notion of performance as a site of agency for lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender people of color, Munoz proposes a theory of disidentification whereby queers of color work within and against dominant ideology to affect change. So you can't say you're outside of it, and you can't say that you're completely in it. You have to work inside and outside at the same time. Disidentification is a mode of dealing with dominant ideology, one that neither opts to assimilate within such a structure nor strictly opposes it. Rather, disidentification is a strategy that works on and against dominant ideology. Instead of buckling under the pressure of dominant ideology or attempting to break free of its inescapable sphere, this working on and against is a strategy that tries to transform a cultural logic from within. At the bottom, you will see the example of Wade in the Water. Does anyone know anything about the singing of the hymn Wade in the Water in the context of slavery?
I think it's about like if you're being chased by slaveholders and you go across the water, the dogs can't smell you anymore.
Can you speak a little louder, Gabe?
Yeah, sorry. I think it's about like if you're being chased by like slave catchers and you cross a body of water, the dogs that are chasing you can't smell anymore. Or can't smell you.
So that's definitely part of it. And so I want to think about in terms of performance, right? Some of you watched 12 Years a Slave. Some of you have seen other movies, right, that have to do with slavery. Generally in the fields, what did the slave master want the slaves to do? While they're working, what generally do we see slaves doing in movies?
Singing.
They're singing. Why are they singing? They're singing so that way they're easier to keep track of. If I can hear you, then I know where you're at. And so I don't have to just depend on my visual field, right? I can turn around. If you get quiet or if I hear a voice disappear, then I know that someone has moved. And so the slave masters and the overseers often wanted slaves to sing. This wasn't just something that slaves did because they were enjoying the work, right? The slave master wanted slaves to sing. So they devised a plan that said we should use this as like basically a public PA system during the day. That if at some point someone is going to try to escape, right, to freedom to the north, they would sing the song Wade in the Water during the day if they knew someone was coming to take them to the Underground Railroad. So if you sang this song, if you wanted to try to run for freedom, you would know. And at night, right, at midnight, you would go to the closest body of water. Like Gabe said, you would try to cross that body of water to try to lose the scent of any dogs. And then that is the way in which you would try to get to freedom. So here's how this uses performance to work on and against the system. So slaves couldn't just pretend they're not slaves. They couldn't just yell and say, I'm not a slave. You can't tell me what to do. I'm going to escape tonight. That wouldn't work. And then if you over-identify with the system of slavery and just say, I'm going to be the best slave I can be, that's also not going to work. That's problematic. What can we do? We can use our performance of slavery, of the obedient slave, to work against the system of slavery. And so singing Wade in the Water as a performance of slavery was used to fight back against the system of slavery and was used as a method of escape. And so at the bottom, right, it says enslaved blacks refused to become helpless victims and enacted agency by cultivating discursive weapons based on their identity as oppressed people. And so Wade in the Water became a discursive weapon that came from slavery, but that was used against slavery. Does anyone have a question about this? Okay, we're gonna move on. So I like everyone to take 1 second and make a note of possible Black queer performances of disidentification or disidentificatory performances that you might have seen. I just want you to keep some in mind. What are other kind of performative weapons that Black people might have used or Black queer people might have used against systems of power? All right. We're going to watch a little clip about the ways in which performances then matter and can be used against systems of power, but also as methods of agency. Does anyone know anything about the ballroom?
I watch it.
Yes. So can you tell us what you know about ballroom?
Okay, so essentially ballroom culture centers around a dance style called voguing, which is a form of dance protest, like performative protest, uh, that especially Black queer people utilize, but I do know that other races and other sexualities can participate in it too.
Okay, awesome. So we're gonna watch about 5 minutes of this clip, so we get a understanding of a lot of at least one type of performativity used by Black queer people as a form of resistance, of agency, and of self-empowerment.
Ballroom is gay Hollywood. It's a chance for us to get dressed up, walk the runway, show who we are, and feel fabulous for a night.
For that one night, sometimes you can forget about everything going on at home. It's therapy.
When you walk ballroom, it's truly a dog-eat-dog world. And if you're able to be successful and make a name for yourself, hooray for you.
Ballroom was created because main society rejected us. We created ballroom for our own safety, for our own sanity. We're a subculture within a subculture, within a subculture. But it's our home.
It is a movement. It is a resistance from the church. It is the resistance from toxic, abusive families who did not accept us. It is the resistance of toxic, abusive neighborhoods that refuse to accept us. It is resistance from schools that we know were going to be traumatic every single day we went there. It's a movement.
Ballroom actually saved my life. Ballroom has took a turn so fast. It's blown up overnight, and I mean everybody went in.
Vogue has hit #1 on the charts.
We have Pose and My House, and we have all these other outlets that's like spotlighting us. Celebrities having balls, celebrities coming to balls.
Nobody knew that ballroom would blow up and be this popular because it was so underground. If you was not a part of ballroom, then you didn't know about it.
You know what she was? Don't be shady, be fair. Give it to her. Tanya. July.
Philly ranked in #3 as far as opening the ballroom scene up. So the first city to host a ball was New York City, the Mecca. Following after that was Newark, New Jersey, and then Philadelphia ballroom scene, 1989. People need to know what happened 30 years ago to keep the city alive for the next 30 years.
This is still all we have. And if we don't preserve it, we're going to lose it.
Tonight, February 2nd, 2019, I present to you legendary best dress presented the East Coast Club, Tanya and Scott.
So a ball is a competition that ballroom houses compete in to win trophies and money.
And this is what we go through for balls. This is what people don't see, the preparation. The scramble. The chaos.
You have a house mother and father, which are the people that run the houses. So basically become your parents. And whatever house you're in, that's your last name to represent the house that you're a part of.
The first ball that I walked was in 1996. this was before transitioning. Transitioning was hard when you are dark-skinned and poor and homeless. Carried a lot of insecurity and stuff with me. But Femme Queen performance was like my escape. It was my way out. How do I define Vogue? Vogue is a unique expression of queer bodies and queer movement, but more importantly, it is a unique expression of Black thought and Black resistance. Vogue is joy. Vogue is freedom. Vogue is life. The components of Vogue: hand performance, floor performance, spins and dips, catwalk, and then duck walk.
Okay, so in that there, if anyone wants links or information about this, you can email me and I can give you the PowerPoint. So what is interesting here is that the ways in which Black queer people disidentify with the system of the family, right? So the family might be kind of a heteronormative idea of one mom, one dad, and then children, right? Because we're supposed to reproduce. And so they reclaim the idea of family, right? People who might have been kicked out on the streets. When this woman at the end says she transitioned, she means she transitioned, right, as a trans person, right? She became the woman that she believed that she was on the inside, right? And that it was about having her external identity, right, match who she knew she was. And that's the transition she's talking about. So having all these folks who may or may not reproduce, who may or may not have biological families anymore, who may or may not be able to have control over their own images or their own identities in any other place. They create, right, their own system of competition, of family, of internal networks, right, across cities like Newark and New York and Philadelphia. And so they take a heteronormative idea of a family and they completely reconstruct it and do something new with it. And so while the ball is really a discursive space where performances, right, can be self-empowering, they're also more than that. They help people negotiate, right, the classed and racialized and gendered reality that they live in and give them really a place where they can have comfort and a support network. The next thing we're going to look at is vernacular performances. So this is also an excerpt from E. Patrick Johnson from the same article. He talks about Quare vernacular tools being used to operate outside the realm of musical and theatrical performance as well. Performance practices such as voguing, snapping, throwing shade, and reading attest to the ways in which Black gays, lesbians, bisexuals, and transgender people demonstrate the ways of devising technologies of self-assertion and summoning agency. Okay, and so it's not always just about performing, right, in the ballroom or being theatrical. Sometimes you have to push back against systems that are pushing on you, right? And so you should think of this as developing a rather sharp tongue. So you can call out violence and you can also defend yourself. We're gonna skip that because they shortened the elective times. And this is an example of one of those vernacular tools at use.
Hello, ladies. I'm a loyal customer here, out with my girlfriends, and we're having just the darndest time trying to relax into this peaceful summer evening.
And what is it that we can do for you?
There's nothing peaceful about your grating voices, cackling so loudly we can't even hear our own conversation.
Electra, do not do it. This one right here is not worth it. I don't think that my girlfriends and I are any louder than these other tables. Why don't you be frank with us? What exactly is it that you're trying to say?
I'm no dummy. I work in the city, and I know a man pretending to be a woman when I see one, and I see...
Sorry.
summer evening.
And what's
peaceful about your grating voices? Cackling so loudly we can't even hear our own conversation.
Electra, do not do it. This one right here is not worth it. I don't think that my girlfriends and I are any louder than these other tables. Why don't you be frank with us? What exactly is it that you're trying to say?
I'm no dummy. I work in the city, and I know a man pretending to be a woman when I see one, and I see three right in front of me. This is not that kind of establishment.
Wait a minute. Girl. God may have blessed you with Barbies, a backyard with a pony in it, a boyfriend named Jake, and an unwanted pregnancy that your father paid to terminate so you could go to college and major in being a basic bitch. None of these things make you a woman.
Clear your throat. Lubricate. And read that bitch.
Your uniform of ill-fitting J.Crew culottes, fake pearls, and 50-cent crunchies cannot conceal the fact that you do not know who you are. I know our presence threatens you. We fought for our place at this table, and that has made us stronger than you will ever be. Now pick your jaw up off the floor and go back to your clam chowder and shallow conversations. My girlfriends and I aren't going anywhere.
It was lovely talking to you.
Y'all heard that?
Go and get your clam chowder before the clam chowder gets you.
Shall we order another round?
Yes, please.
Shit.
Now that is a read, okay? I need to, for some reason, the chat will not cooperate, so I need to stop screen sharing. Oh, okay. There's people saying that they appreciate this clip. It's a great clip. This is a great moment. This is truly vernacular performances of resistance. And so they're in a very white space, a very transphobic space, right? And Electra Abundance, right, from the House of Abundance, right, decides that enough is enough. I belong here, and I don't really have any time for your nonsense. And so she does what's called reading, right? She looks for flaws. She looks for cracks. She looks for problems in her kind of rhetorical or situational opponent, right? And so she both defends herself and attacks the same way that you would in a debate. So this is what E. Patrick Johnson means in terms of vernaculars of resistance, or at least partly.
Hello, ladies.
Now, so we talked about vernacular and we talked about voguing, but it's not all reading people in restaurants and rainbows. Sometimes, right, we have to look at the materiality of things. We have to look at political practice. And so we have someone who was part of the civil rights movement, didn't get as much credit because, given the way radical Black subjectivity works, he chose to stand in the background, right, and not try to take up space. As you can see him literally standing behind Martin Luther King, because he realized that being Black and queer meant that you sometimes have to make choices. There's sometimes a forced choice. And while he wasn't excluded from the movement for being queer, he could not be a public face of the movement, at least in context of like the larger national movement, because of heteronormativity.
I am not ready to die. I want no Negro to die. I want no human being to die or to be brutalized, because I thoroughly believe that this struggle can be won without brutalization. We will not tolerate the beating on of Black people any longer. We will stay in these damn streets until every Negro in the country can vote. We call for a non-violent uprising with people sitting, standing, being arrested, white and black together.
Quare liked to cause trouble. He caused trouble in very banal and everyday ways, and he caused trouble in world historical ways.
We have been told that we will be arrested if we stay here.
Quare's life was over some 60 years of activism. And almost every major event between the 40s through the 70s, Quare played a role.
Sit down, I can't sit down. Now won't you sit down, I can't sit down. Just go to heaven.
So we have Bayard Rustin, who's part of the civil rights movement, right? And he, of course, is fighting for the entirety, right, of the black race, and has to kind of choose, you know, between blackness and queerness. And so he can't represent himself as queer. He must, you know, radically choose, right? And his choice was, you know, I have to identify with the Negro or the black movement at the time. But still, his performances, these protests are not just kind of theoretical. They are flesh and blood, right? Putting your body on the line in order to create material change, right? It's about praxis of material change.
The modern civil rights.
We also have Laverne Cox here talking about Marsha P. Johnson and Sylvia Rivera. I tried to find something that wasn't very vulgar and that also did not frame them only in terms of their deaths. And so I found that this was the best tribute to explain who they were.
When I think about Sylvia and Marsha, I think what I owe to them is this history of struggle, this history of fighting and being pushed aside and fighting some more and never giving up on the fight. And I think it's so important for us to remember them and to remember the truth of their lives and the truth of their struggle so that we don't repeat this disregard for certain people and certain populations. It took some street queens and hustlers to fight back against the police on that fateful day in 1969. And that moment was a catalyst for a movement that has brought us years later marriage equality, and hopefully will bring us equal protections for trans people on a federal level. When we think about the truth of their lives and how they struggled and how they lived, I think it should be a lesson. And their example was to love and give no matter what. Star's legacy is that.
So, and for those that don't know, there's actually a picture of one of them here on the screen. If you look at this first video, Marsha P. Johnson was a black trans woman who participated in the Stonewall riots, which was just a kind of hole in the wall bar that queer people in the Village in New York City, right, used to go to. And so the police, of course, would come and harass them and say, you know, that they didn't belong there. Sylvia Rivera was a Latina trans woman who also, you know, hung out here. So while they are historically credited for starting, right, this kind of, you know, fight against the police, they weren't actually the ones who started it. They were just the ones who said, we're going to finish it. And so that is really how you get the birth of Pride. It's how you get the birth of the queer rights movement. It's how you get marriage equality, because of the work of these two trans women, particularly trans women of color. So now we're going to talk about what does queer theory look like in debate. We have about 10 minutes left. And so I have about 5 different ways that these theories of disidentification and performativity, et cetera, have been used in debate. So first was in 2013, Emporia SW won the NDT and was the first team to unite the crowns of CETA and the NDT in college policy debate. They read an AF. There's a quick screenshot of the top of the AF, right? That was about home place. And so if you notice, right, there's an ongoing theme about Black queer people trying to find home, right? So we have the Wizard of Oz, right? And we have Dorothy saying, there's no place like home. There's no place like home, right? And so this movie, right, The Wiz, disidentifies, right? It uses The Wiz, which is historically a white movie, right, and inserts Black characters and Black themes, right? So we have Michael Jackson, Diana Ross, right? This is like, I think Diana Ross is another one of the Rosses, and I forgot his name, right? But it uses historically famous Black people to create a space, an opening for Black people to have stories in the mainstream. Emporia SW then wrote an AF about home place in debate and said that just like the Black Dorothy in The Wiz, we should use debate, we should use our narratives, we should use our Black queerness, and we should disidentify with debate. And we should use debate, which is a violent place, and we should use it to create a little opening for Black people and Black queer people to find a place of reprieve. So the same way that ballrooms were used, right, and that this notion of the family was reclaimed, we said we can reclaim debate, and we told a story about basically the struggle to find home place and to disidentify with the structure of debate. And so the 1AC was a disidentification with the debate space and used Black queer theory and performance theory to talk about the ways in which we can push debate to be a home. This is also a long time ago, and debate always shows its white supremacist head. And so this notion of a home place was short-lived, but did affect the way in which people theorize about arguments and coalitions and performativity in debate. There was also a debate at one point where we used this argument as a Black queer theology critique. So we debated an AF that was a queer theology argument that said that we can reclaim, notions of theology, and we can just talk about Jesus as queer. And so their AF was very graphic and had a lot of problematic things. And so, we just prepared, a conversation about how all theological struggles and all historical struggles of Black people, specifically Black queer people, have to be still grounded in the church. So even if the church is problematic, their affirmative asks us to give up those people who we are connected to, right? And of course, these were white and queer people. And we said, well, the forced choice that you give us between moving on with you and your strategy and the church, which you say you criticize, we can't, trust you or believe in your ability to provide resources. And so you create a forced choice and you force Black queerness into an and or position. Of course, the representation of Jesus in the 1NC was race neutral. We were like, what color is Jesus? They were like, he's Black. So we started asking questions about, representation and theology and their relationship to class and racialized structures. And of course, they said they were more so queer theory. They didn't really have a relationship to the particular or to a class and material struggle. So we won this debate on a 2-1 decision at the NDT because theology needs to be connected to, even if the church might not be perfect, we can disidentify with the church, we can disidentify with Blackness, we can reclaim those structures and put them in the service of resistance. Just like the card that kind of cited Foucault, power is not totalizing. We can use power against it. So we can use the Black church in queer ways. We can use the Black church to empower Black queer people, but we can't abandon them in favor of a kind of homogenizing and all freedom inclusive idea of queerness. Quare theory has also been used historically as a identity politics critique, like any other one, such as Black feminism or queer theory or Afro-pessimism sometimes is used like an identity politics critique, and is probably the closest idea that you would have if you just kind of walked into debate in 2020. So the first thing it says, of course, based on E. Patrick Johnson's theory, is that queer theory is bad. The second thing, based on radical Black subjectivity, is that a single variable, right, a single identity, single variable racial politics are bad. So teams that, read a 1AC that is singularly about race links directly to E. Patrick Johnson's criticism of a identity politics that is not super inclusive and doesn't attend to the specific needs of Black queer people. There's also other, research that helps with that. So it wasn't just, E. Patrick Johnson cards, but it was about the theory from E. Patrick Johnson. And then in earlier times of ontology debates, you can still use this. critic ontological takes on blackness would preclude a value from performativity. They would preclude a value of understanding yourself as black and queer. And so if understanding yourself as black and queer is your kind of strategy that helps you to survive or to push back against power or to negotiate with power, Afro-pessimism or ontology arguments then trade off with a queer understanding of power and would in fact indict those strategies that black queer people use on a daily basis to help themselves navigate the struggle. The next one is some people in the K-Lab will be more familiar with this, but this was called the Quare pick. And so if you imagine a plan being read on the AF, you can use those vernacular tools that E. Patrick Johnson talked about to basically turn queer theory into a counterplan. And so this would be the use of black queer or queer vernacular to rewrite the plan and to talk about the ways in which black queer performances are empowering. So if you read this against a plan, it solves the entirety of the plan, but has an added performative net benefit of queerness. And you can theorize about disidentification and queer theory, and all those things become net benefits. So we see, things like, Banji, trade. We have a reference to house. So the White House versus the House of America. We have kind of a play on words and a reference to ballroom culture. We have black queer references to coins, which is black queer understanding of money. We have tea, we have shade. And so I won't go into all of that, but this is a black kind of counter performance with queerness as a net benefit. As we saw with the Electra Abundance, you can reread the 1AC. And so you can raise criticisms of the 1AC about their style and their content. You can also have a praxis disad. And so as we saw, it's not just about performances, it's not just about snappy retorts, it's not just about reading, but if an affirmative is just theory, but refuses to have the kind of practice of Bayard Rustin or of Marsha P. Johnson or others, there you can say that that is problematic and trades off with our ability to create material change. So E. Patrick Johnson is explicitly saying that we can't just be armchair activists, we have to theorize about how can we create material change. So there's a praxis disadvantage that comes from queer theory. And that is all. In terms of different theories. So you all have to be in your labs in about 3 minutes. And so if anyone has a quick question, I can answer it. And you can also send me an email. I didn't realize that until this morning that the amount of time I had was different from last week. So if anyone has a quick, I know I went through the last slides a little quickly. Does anyone have a question?
Yeah, I do. It's about the resisting and reconstructing the archive thing from earlier when E. Patrick Johnson was explaining his work. I'm not sure how this impacts how, I guess, is reconstructing the archive part of producing performance and how queer theory is more better?
So that is just what work he believes he's doing. Black queer stories don't get told, right? For example, Marsha P. Johnson, Pride is seen as almost all white, right? When you see As for Pride, they don't include people of color. When you look at the civil rights movement, Bayard Rustin and other folks who were queer, right? We don't really mention their queerness or their struggles to be queer or to find partners or to have health insurance or for marriage or things like that. So his work, he finds, is to archive those things and to theorize about those things and to bring them to the forefront.
That makes sense.
Lee has a question. No. So thank you all for coming. Hopefully you learned something about E. Patrick Johnson. His work is